So this video will focus on question number 8, which asks you to reflect on liberal democracy. And there's two possible questions to answer here. You only answer one of these two. So the chapter on liberal democracy is one of the longer and more complex of the chapters, but the ideas are really important because they are ones that are still very prevalent today when people talk about democracy. So the first possible question you could answer about liberal democracy is part A, 8A. Liberal democracy is a concept that continues to inform democracy in the 21st century. At its minimal meaning, so its basic meaning, the liberal tradition refers to an attempt to uphold the values of freedom of choice, reason, and tolerance. Several key theorists have developed components of the idea of liberal democracy, including Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu, James Madison, Jeremy Bentham, and James Mill. So what I want you to do here is choose two of these theorists and discuss the differences and similarities in their ideas about liberal democracy. 8B, so you can choose either A or B. 8B says, in chapter 3 of the textbook, David Howell discusses two strands of liberal democracy, protective democracy and developmental democracy. And what I want you to do here is to compare and contrast these two strands by referring to major philosophical ideas, such as the state of nature, the social contract, private interest versus public good, the problem of faction, and or utilitarianism. So these ideas that contributed to these models of liberal democracy. So you'll remember, we've got lots of slides. You can go back and look at the slides for each of these weeks, as well as looking in the textbook. So question 8 allows you to focus on the ideas of different philosophers, while question 9 allows you to focus on the concepts of protective democracy and developmental democracy. You'll remember that in general terms, liberalism is about the attempt to uphold the values of freedom of choice, reason, and toleration in the face of tyranny, the absolutist system, and religious intolerance. So liberalism aimed to restrict the powers of both the church and the divine rights of kings by challenging the powers of the priests and the church. So giving more power to the people rather than just the church. And the powers of kings were also challenged in order to separate the private from the public. In other words, they sought to have a private sphere, so the home and personal life, that's independent from the public sphere or the church and state. And so the goal was to have one, a government that was free from religious control, and two, to free society, civil society, so the personal life, family life, business life, from political interference. And here we have Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who brought to political thought the idea of the sovereign individual. Here, the sovereign means an individual has control over his or her life. So a sovereign individual is, someone who has control over himself and is capable of shaping organized government to his will and to his needs. And so you can compare this to the medieval Christian worldview of that sort of static hierarchy of ranks and orders of the great chain of being as ordained by God, where an individual is not allowed to move outside the sphere or class into which he was born. And so Hobbes's ideas are a transition point between a commitment to absolutism and the struggle of liberalism against tyranny. So we have these questions of, how is order possible? And he says, by accepting a tyrant who is strong enough to protect us from us destroying each other. Where John Locke, his ideas form the start of the liberal constitutionalist tradition, so control over the that Leviathan or tyrant that Hobbes talks about. And so there are similarities between Hobbes and Locke. But there are also differences. So this is where, does government protect us from ourselves, or is government protecting our natural rights? Under Hobbes, people hand power over to the government, but under John Locke, people retain power or sovereignty of a form of government to protect their natural rights, and so on. So be aware of how they are different. Then we have Montesquieu, who was focused on the separation of powers. So Montesquieu was a follower of Locke, and he advocated for a reformed representative government that followed notions of freedom, toleration, and moderation that were embedded in the British Constitution, the English Constitution. And he analyzed a variety of conditions of freedom, but the most notable one was about how constitutions might set firm or unbreakable limits to state action. And Montesquieu saw a constitutional government as the main way of guaranteeing the rights of the adult male property owning individual. So although he believed in a given and unchangeable natural law, he also believed in the development of a formal legal structure that was designed for the regulation of the public and private life. So he moves away from more traditional understandings of monarchy and aristocracy and so on. And instead he describes the republic as being based on virtue. The monarchy as being based on honor, and despotism as being based on fear. And so in these definitions, he focuses on how policy is conducted by the government rather than where power is located, which was different from what other thinkers had done. And so you can be aware of where he draws some of his ideas and so on. Now, James Madison, you'll remember, was an American statesman, lawyer, diplomat, and philosopher. He served as the fourth president of the United States, and he played a really pivotal role in drafting and promoting the Constitution of the United States and the United States Bill of Rights. Now, like Plato and like Montesquieu, Madison was critiquing classical democracy as being really only useful for small political communities and city-states. So we're talking about Athenian classical democracy. Now, Madison does have quite a pessimistic view of human nature, and he believes that individuals pursued their own self-interest, and because they did so, dissent, argument, clashes of judgment, conflicts of interest, and so on were inevitable. So he's talking about factions. This is where he talks about the idea that factions are inevitable and we cannot get away from them. And there's more, of course. He talks about the economy being based on private wants and so on. But he does believe in the importance of a constitution. You'll remember our discussion of Jeremy Bentham and James Mill because we talked about utilitarianism. And this was one of the key ideas that they came up with. So based on the premise that humans act to satisfy desire and avoid pain, the idea of utilitarianism comes out of this, right? So the idea of utilitarianism is that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the most number of people and the least amount of pain for the most number of people. So that's the premise. It makes sense logically when you think about it, but there are some potential problems, of course. And so the theory of utilitarianism is important here, and it's important in creating this protective theory of democracy. So these two theorists develop these ideas, and they believed in a fairly minimal state. So you should look at what their goals were and what they thought of protective democracy. Now, the ideas of John Stuart Mill, who was the son of James Mill from the previous slide, are at the center of the transition from the early liberal to more modern liberal democratic ideas and institutions. He's still using the principle of utilitarianism in making his argument. And he engages in a discussion of the meaning of liberty for citizens of the modern state, asking to what extent can society legitimately exercise power over the individual? And when he answers this question, he makes this argument against absolute power and despotism, including from an oppressive majority or an overactive bureaucratic state. So it doesn't have to just be like a kingship type of situation. On the one hand, if an individual's actions has no impact on anyone other than himself, he says, then society or government should not interfere. On the other hand, Mill also suggests that interference with liberty can occur when an action harms other people. So, of course, this begs the question of how do we define harm? But these issues are important, and out of this utilitarianism comes his argument for equal rights for women. So if you're answering the question on the role of women in democracy, you could draw on John Stuart Mill as well as Mary Wollstonecraft. So you can take a look at that, and I will address the next questions, the critiques of liberal democracy, in another video. Thank you.